You know, idolatry was an evil that plagued the land of Israel. Baal must be destroyed before God could even bless the armies of Israel. And so the first blow in this great contest was coming as a blow struck against Baal worship. Gideon could not fight the battles of Israel while the altar of Baal crowned the heights of his native city, so his action began with a deed as bold as that of Luther when he burned a papal bull in the sight of all the people. While men slept, little dreaming of what was about to happen, he rose from his bed, called 10 of his servants. They marched straight up to the altar of Baal, surrounded with such awe and superstition. They threw it down. They cut down the statue or pillars of Ashtaroth. And before the morning, the altar of Jehovah was smoking with its burnt offering, and its open, conspicuous defilement or opposition to the altar of Baal. It's kind of interesting. The people came up and they were ready to kill Gideon. And the father came to his defense and says, if Baal be God, let him defend himself. He's just stone, he's just wood. Let him defend himself. But there's a lesson: we dare not enter upon any work for God while any known sins casting its deadly shade upon our souls. If we're seeking to do something bold for God, it's like we got to pluck out the beam out of our own eye before we remove the splinter from our brother's eye. It's kind of interesting, a study of Gideon, time of Judges. We can almost entitle this sermon, Gideon's Gallant Group. Gideon was the opposition to 135,000 Midianite soldiers. And Gideon was visited by an angel of God, and he's commanded by God to go and lead the Israelites to victory. And of course, Gideon comes up with this idea. He's going to put out a fleece, and if the ground around it's wet, the fleece is dry, then God means go. And, well, God, I'm not too sure. Now let the fleece be wet and the dry ground around it, if that you really want me to go. You know, God really did not command and want him to do all this wet fleece, dry fleece bit. I guess God, in his patience and his graciousness, put up with Gideon. Charles Wesley tried the same thing. He was supposed to be marrying a girl, and he belonged to this holy club of the Methodist Church, and they advised those that were leaders not to get married. But he fell in love with this beautiful, beautiful spiritual young lady, and he was in love. So they put out a lottery. They just, one of these pieces of paper says, marry her. Another piece of paper says, don't marry her. And the third piece of paper says, wait a year. So he closed his eyes and reached up and pulled out the thing, and much to his chagrin and much to his sadness, it said, don't marry her. So much for lotteries. Years went by and he fell in love with another woman. This time, instead of using chance, he decided to use his mind in making his choices. So he looked through and he took down a listing of 7 qualities that would make a perfect Christian wife. You know, one that was a co-laborer in the gospel, and one that was a generous soul, and one that could cook, and one that was affectionate, and one that was honest, and one that was full of integrity. And he had all these characteristics all put together. And his brother came to this woman and said, you're not going to marry this guy because it'll mess up your ministry. You can't be married. We're too busy preaching. And so the brother actually passed out and fainted at this woman's feet. She got scared and she married the other guy. So that's strike 2. Years go by and he marries his third woman. And this time he decided just to marry. I don't know what the criteria was this time. He just married her. She was wealthy. Well, they were married for 20 years. He was miserable. She was miserable. She left him. And in his diary he said, I'm not going after her, and I'm not inviting her back. Which means she's gone her way and I've gone my way, and we're happy this way. Now I say this about this. If a congregation says, we're going to raise up $100,000 to buy a piece of property to build a church, and the church ends up coming up with only $90,000, that means God's will's not in it? That you're 10,000 shy and said we can't do it because we didn't get exactly 100,000? Because people set up these criteria for God to operate under. God doesn't necessarily operate by our criteria. God told Gideon to go. He commanded him to go. He said an angel told him to go, a messenger angel, and says go. And Gideon come up with this fangled idea of pulling straws or casting lots or flipping a coin or a shekel or something to say, well, heads I win, tails you lose. You know, one of those deals. God said go. But God put up with Gideon because he had a job to do. In the book of Judges, chapter 7, we have this particular story. It says, early in the morning, Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all his men camped at the spring of Harod. The camp of the Midianites was north of them in the valley near the hill of Morah. The Lord said to Gideon, you have too many men for me to deliver Midian into their hands, in order that Israel may not boast against me that her own strength has saved her. Announce now to the people, anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave Mount Gilead. So 22,000 men left, while 10,000 remained. 32,000 men. And God said, your army's too big. Well, here was the Battle of Gettysburg, and Dr. Pat shared this with me. It was the main 20th on the Battle of Little Round Top. And if you notice in these battle lines, if they fell, the rebels would swoop around and hit them on the flank and they'd be unprotected. And they're just a few hundred men and they ran out of bullets. So their commanding officer and their commanders were not seasoned men from Annapolis or any one of the academies. I think one was a professor, was a school teacher. Pulled out of the classroom and says, okay, you're leaders of classroom, now you're going to be a leader of men. And so the commanding officer said, fix bayonets. They had no bullets, so the only thing they had left was fixed bayonets. And they come running a Yankee charge down the Little Round Top. And the rebel troops scattered because they thought the woods were full of them. And there weren't that many of them, but they scared the pudding out of them. And in that particular battle, I think as far as in the statistics and all of that particular battle, July 1st through 3rd, 1863, that the 20th Maine Volunteer Infantry Regiment, low on ammo, ran their charge, and the rebels scattered, and I don't know how many people were killed in that particular effort. The Battle of Little Round Top. Gideon, meanwhile, had his 10 servants. And then somehow or another he gathered 32,000 men. But the enemy still numbered 135,000. The odds were 4 to 1. Now somebody came and criticized the Swiss army. The Swiss army at one time contained 100,000 troops. And somebody chided the Swiss commander and said, well, what happens if 200,000 people invade Switzerland? The commander of Switzerland said, simple. Every man shoots his rifle twice. So much for Swiss guard and Swiss integrity and Swiss way of doing things. The unwilling. Whoever is fearful and afraid, let him return and depart. 2/3 of his army left. 22,000 left. Their hearts fail. Their homes were unprotected. The Midianites were so fierce in their minds, so numerous in their minds, so irresistible in their minds, that they decided to go home. Their faith in God was a dead letter. The shame of deserting their comrades didn't restrain them a bit. They left camp to return home. Now the odds were 14 to 1. There's a lot of sincere people in the world today, and many sincere people in the church today who come to church once in a while, but when it comes to being sold out to Christ, they have foxhole religion. When the going gets rough and they get criticized by the world, or they wear their feelings on their sleeves, they go home. They quit. They're not sticking with it. They're not sticking their neck out. They don't want to be looked at as a religious fanatic. I'm going home. I'm going church hopping. I'm going church shopping. I'm going to go do something else. Find somebody else to go fight in the army. The willing. The Battle of Poitiers. This was another battle similar. In this particular battle there were the British longbows. And the British longbows had an advantage over the crossbow. The crossbow could pierce armor, but it did not have the distance of the British longbow. And after the British longbows did what they did, 8,000 Frenchmen lay dead. And this was a battle where the few, having the right weaponry, ended up winning. The Bible goes on to say, so Gideon took the men down, verse 4, but the Lord said to Gideon, there are still too many men, and Gideon would say, too many men? I'm down to 10,000. There's 135,000 of them. God says, you still got too many. So I'm going to take them down to the water, and I'm going to sift them for you there. If I say this one shall go with you, he shall go, but I'll say to this one, he shall not go with you, he shall not go. So Gideon took the men down to the water. There the Lord told him, separate those who lap the water with their tongues, like a dog from those who kneel down to drink. 300 men lapped with their hands to their mouth, and the rest got down on their knees to drink. And the Lord said to Gideon, with the 300 men that lapped, I will save you, and give the Midianites into your hands. Let all the other men go, each to his own place. So Gideon sent the rest of the Israelites to their tents, but kept the 300 who took over the provisions and trumpets of the others. The 10,000 were willing, but they were unprepared. This stream that was in close to the battlefield and close to the Midianites was in full open sight. And here you have men that went down to drink, and some fell down on their face and stuck their mouth into the water and their eyes into the water, and they drank that way. Others cautiously looked, and they took the water into their hand and drank and looked, but they were very observant. The observant ones remained, 300 strong. The ones that fell down on their face, not observant, not looking, not being aware, were the ones he sent home. The lapping of the dogs, what a test. The Battle of Thermopylae. You know this movie that came out, 300 Spartans? Now that's Hollywood. You know how many there really were? Now they said the Persian army under Xerxes, and Xerxes happened to be the husband to none other than our Bible queen Esther. Some record 1 million soldiers. Others record 100 to 150,000 soldiers. The Greeks had 7,000. And once they went into retreat, holding off the Persian army, there were 400 Thebans, 700 Thespians, and 300 Spartans. So you actually had 7,000 men. They left 1,400 men behind as a rear guard. Of course, the movie says the 300. But that's Hollywood. That's not history. But the unfortunate thing is these guys were rear guard, and they laid down their lives so the other 6,500 or 6,000 men could retreat. and that was the Battle of Thermopylae. They held off the Persians. They killed thousands. The Persians found a way through the mountains. They got behind the Spartans. The Spartans fought to the death, killing as many Persians as they could. King Leonidas and the Spartan army's heroic last stand delayed the Persian advances and allowed other Greek city-states to unify. Then eventually the Greeks threw them off. Now we have the 300 that did it all. Judges chapter 7, verses 6 and 8. 300 men lapped with their hands to their mouths. All the rest got down on their knees to drink. The Lord said to Gideon, with the 300 men that lapped I will save you and give the Midianites into your hands. Let all the other men go, each to his own place. So Gideon sent the rest of Israel to their tents, but kept the 300, who took over the provisions and trumpets of the others. Now the camp of Midian lay below him in the valley. During that night the Lord said to Gideon, get up and go down against the camp. And Gideon went down with another man, and God caused a deep sleep to fall on most of them. But then a few of these guys were talking about that the hills are full of them. We don't stand a chance. God's against us. And they were scared. And he overheard the rumors and the mumbling, the murmuring going on down in the camp. And so whenever God allowed Gideon to hear the attitude and the lack of courage and bravery and resolve among the Persians, he came back with more holy boldness. You remember that Davy Crockett movie where the Creek Indians had surrounded the colonel and they were ready to take over, and they all of a sudden Davy Crockett led Company A down there. Company A, charge! And then Georgie Russell led Company B. Company B, charge! Bam, 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 bam. And the Indians scattered. The woods were full of them. And then the colonel turns and says, Company A reporting? And he's looking at Davy Crockett. And then Georgie Russell steps up there and he says, Company B reporting, sir. Just two of you? Well, that's all we needed. Just the two. And God's looking at the same way with the 135,000 Midianites. He says, all I need is 300. They're armed with a trumpet. They're armed with a torch and a pitcher of the torch. And whenever they cracked the pitcher, it made the noise of 300 cracked pitcher in the quietness of the night. All of a sudden, all these torches go up, looking that there's, 300 platoons of the enemy, and all of a sudden there's 300 battle trumpets are sounded. It sounds like the entire cavalry are coming in by the hundreds of thousands. And there was that panic. And what did they say? The sword of the Lord and of Gideon. It's almost the same as they had the Battle of the Alamo. After the Alamo, they came up with the expression, remember the Alamo, and that became the battle cry. But as we had this battle going on and the panic of the enemy, they all scattered. Pizarro, 170 men, conquistadores they called them. They came out against 40,000 Inca Indians. These Indians had wooden spears that could not stand against the Sheffield steel, the broadswords, the horses, and the armor. And in the thick of battle, 5,000 Incas lay dead, 5,000 were let off, and the rest were scattered to the wind. There's only one injury. That was Pizarro. He held out his hand to protect the Inca chief from his men. And that was the only wound, his hand protecting the Inca chief. 170 men against 40,000. When we look at the man Gideon, how many did Gideon need? A mere 300. This was one of the battles in South Africa. In this particular battle, it was the Afrikaners. They numbered 464. They're Dutch pioneers and their servants. They're confronted by 12,500 Zulu warriors with an attitude and some sharp spears. The results of this particular battle: 3 of the Afrikaners were slightly injured. 3,000 Zulu lay dead. 464 against 12,500. I'm going to say the sword of the Lord and of Gideon, the battle belongs to the Lord. When people pray, things happen. Winston Churchill made this statement. He says, "I look forward confidently to the exploits of our fighter pilots, these splendid men, this brilliant youth, who would brave the glory and in saving their nation land, their valiant homes, and all they love, from the most deadly of all attacks." Hitler says, "I order the following: the German air forces must with all means in their power to as quickly as possible destroy the English Air Force. The fate of Britain, perhaps the fate of the world, rests in the hands of about 1,000 called beardless warriors. Most of them are under 21 years of age. They face the mighty Luftwaffe of the largest, most powerful air force in Europe or in the world. And they won. And this is another story." Incredible. The 300 who remained, who had a rigid self-denial, a stern self-discipline, a self-possession, a presence of mind, they had the mettle necessary for a hazardous undertaking requiring boldness, endurance, and perseverance. Back in the 1800s, a French detective, his superiors said, "You're going to need at least 1,000 police to clean out that band of thieves." He says, "No, just give me 8 men. And the 8 men were gathered outside this den of iniquity with sacks of handcuffs. And this French Sherlock Holmes, dressed in black, entered the den, introduced himself as who he was, and the men put down their weapons and filed an order out and were handcuffed as they filed out the door. How many did he need? 8 men dedicated. We're looking at Elliot Ness and the Untouchables, with just a small band who were beyond bullets and bribery, did what the entire police department of Chicago couldn't do, and that was put Al Capone behind bars. The willing, but the unprepared, are like those who come willingly but are unprepared to teach a class or give a prayer or lead a service or visit the sick and the shut-ins. I'm just wondering, when we talk about the next time, I remember they had a church work day over in Orlando. Congregation was about 50. And the only ones that showed up for the church work day to paint the church house was one of the older men and the preacher. 2 showed up for work day. And then you think, have things changed, as far as you take the finer sieve to separate the 10,000, leave the 300. If we separate the sieve from the careless, the selfish, and the worldly, and the lukewarm, and isolate the true saints of God, that little flock, the faithful followers, the good ground of the parable of the seed that fell on, or what the Bible says, straight is the gate and narrow is the way that leadeth to life, or as 1 Peter 4:17 and 18 says, if the righteous scarcely are saved, where shall the ungodly and the sinner appear? Edward A. Hale said this, I am only one, but still I'm one. I cannot do everything, but still I can do something. And because I cannot do everything, I will not refuse to do the something I can do. We are only one. You are only one. But you are so important to the cause of Jesus Christ in making a difference. Gideon's gallant group. Peace in the land. Israel does evil. God punishes evil. Israel cries out to the Lord. God raises up the judge Gideon. Israel's delivered, and there's peace. The cycle that's repeated 7 times. We're going to have Glenn lead us in this particular song, Onward.